Hey, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to the Fantasy Headliners. Kyle coming to you from the Draft.com studios. And I know we're missing that funny and clever opening that we typically begin our videos with, but we have a ton of information to get into today, and I want to make sure that we get into all of it without making the video too long. So the purpose of this video today, titled Red Zone Report, is going to highlight an article that we're going to have coming out on the website every couple of weeks during the season. One of our writers, Tony Culler, is going to be doing this article, and it's going to be talking about players within the red zone and how they are performing. We're going to talk about quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So then you get an idea of what players are, or how players are performing, and what players are performing well when they get into the red zone. I think this is a critical report that a lot of people are going to get a lot of useful information out of that's going to help you win some fantasy football leagues. So make sure the fantasyheadliners.com, you keep an eye on that. Also, make sure you follow Tony on Twitter at FantasyGold. It's FNTSY Gold. Make sure you give him a follow. He's going to be doing this all season long. Without further ado, let's get into our red zone report. We're going to highlight some of the top performers from 2018. All right, so we're going to kick things off talking about running backs, and there's one player in particular that I want to highlight in this episode because I've been contemplating moving him up to the #1 overall running back by the time I submit my final rankings. Of course, that's going to hinge on whether or not Ezekiel Elliott shows up. If he does, then this guy will end up being number 2. But the main guy that I want to talk about is going to be ALVIN KAMARA. Now, in the red zone, this guy absolutely dominated. And I think a lot of times when you look at these running back committees, especially a one like ALVIN KAMARA and Mark Ingram that we saw last season, you automatically look at Mark Ingram and say, okay, that's the guy that when they're in the red zone, he's going to be the bruising back. He's going to be the guy that they give the ball to. But even with Mark Ingram last year, ALVIN KAMARA was awesome in the red zone. Last season, he was tied for #1 in red zone targets. He had 25. That was tied with another guy that we're highlighting, James White. Both of them had 25 targets. ALVIN KAMARA was first in red zone receptions with 20 red zone receptions. James White was second with 19 red zone receptions. And then he drops down a little bit, so he was tied for third with 4 red zone TDs. James White was first with 7 red zone touchdowns. So both of those guys, as soon as their teams got into the red zone in the passing game, they saw a ton of work. ALVIN KAMARA, too, his target percentage was second in the league with 25.5% target percentage in the red zone. And then his reception percentage in the red zone was 24.7%. That was second overall in the league. Now, again, we talked about James White and ALVIN KAMARA there catching the ball, but what about running the ball? Well, you might be a little shocked to know that ALVIN KAMARA also ran the ball a lot in the red zone. 51 carries in the red zone last year. That was second only to Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley had 64, and then Saquon Barkley was third with 50. So KAMARA was a red zone beast in 2018. In 2019, with Latavius Murray there, I don't expect that to change at all. In fact, I think you're going to see his workload increase a little bit, and you're going to continue to see this same type of red zone usage, and that's why I have him all the way up to my running back 2. Now, if for some reason Ezekiel Elliott doesn't show up, then we're going to be bumping ALVIN KAMARA up to running back 1. Also to keep in mind, his rushing touchdowns in the red zone last year, 13. That was also second, only behind Todd Gurley, who had 17. And then his red zone percentage for carries was also second, 26.3% on his red zone carries, which is a fantastic number. So last season in the red zone, ALVIN KAMARA was an absolute beast through the air and on the ground. Once they got to the red zone, ALVIN KAMARA was the #1 priority for Drew Brees. I talked about in another episode that recently came out about Traquan Smith. If you didn't catch that episode when I talked about breakouts, I talked about his usage in the red zone and end zone quite a bit. When you've got a target like that was looked at a lot in the red zone and the end zone last year, when you got a guy like Michael Thomas, and now with the addition of Jared Cook this season, now you have even more weapons to spread the defense out, and that's even more opportunity for ALVIN KAMARA to excel in the red zone. That's why if you have a draft that you haven't done yet, definitely make sure ALVIN KAMARA is one of your top top picks. If you have a top, well, he's going to have to be basically 1, 2, or 3 at this point. Haven't really seen him falling to 4 too often. And on top of that, if you have an opportunity to trade for him, definitely trade for him. And then also mentioned it with James White. He was a fantastic target for Tom Brady in the red zone last year as well. I don't expect that to change much this season. He should still continue to see some of that same usage. All right, now we're going to move on to wide receivers. With running backs, I used that opportunity to talk up a couple of different players. James White, ALVIN KAMARA, we use that information to tell you how successful they can end up being 2019. However, for wide receivers, I'm actually going to use this information to caution you on a player that a lot of fantasy owners are viewing as a legit wide receiver to this season. In terms of the volume he got and the actual outcome, he may have been more lucky than good last season. So let's jump into the numbers. There's going to be a lot of familiar names, but there might be one that you're not nearly as familiar with. All right, in the red zone last season, you see, there's a lot of the same names that you see out there. The DeAndre Hopkins, the Julio Jones, Devontae Adams, all of that. They lead the league in targets. They lead the league in receptions when it comes to their work in the red zone. However, when we start getting into some of the nitty-gritty with these red zone target numbers, one guy I want to caution you on is Mike Williams from the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, for red zone touchdowns last season, he was tied for third in the league. Adams had 13, Brown had 12, and then Williams was tied with Hopkins for 10 touchdowns in the red zone last season. Not only that, but his target percentage last season in the red zone was 37.5%. And his actual reception percentage in the red zone last year was 37.2. His reception percentage at 37.2 made him the second highest in the league, and then his target percentage of 37.5 made him the third highest in the league. Now, the reason that I am cautioning you on that is because what his other numbers look like. His target numbers last season in the red zone, he only had 24 targets. That was 23rd in the league. He only had 16 receptions. It was a little bit higher. That puts him up at 13. But basically 16 receptions in the red zone last year. He turned 10 of those into touchdowns. That's the type of volume that we look at and we see, okay, this is the volume he's getting. This is the outcome. And then the outcome doesn't seem to match up because was it luck? Was it scheme? What was it? It seems to be that those numbers tell me because he didn't have a high volume there, that it was a little bit more luck than anything. I mean, a guy like Devontae Adams had 46 targets for 23 receptions, turned 23 receptions into 13 touchdowns. That we look at and we say, okay, there's quite a bit of volume there, so he has more opportunity. Mike Williams just turned a little bit of opportunity into a lot of upside. When you look at end zone targets as well, he was pretty high up there as well. 18.8% of his targets were in the end zone last year. That was for fourth best, and then he was second best in terms of red zone end zone reception percentage at 16.3. Again, that put him at number 2 overall. So with those numbers there, again, that's to caution you and say, look, a lot of people are buying into Mike Williams this year, and I get it. I understand why. If Keenan Allen has injury issues, absolutely. If Melvin Gordon ends up missing a bunch of time, absolutely. Because then he has a chance to get more and more and more red zone opportunities, more and more volume. That volume could then end up turning into him being able to sustain those numbers. But I think you also have to keep in mind Hunter Henry is going to be back. We love Hunter Henry on the fantasy headliners. We think he's in for a huge season. I have him as my tight end 4. That's how high I am on him this year. He could end up cutting into some of that Mike Williams red zone usage that we saw him have last year. So be cautioned with that, okay? Mike Williams is going to play, but he's going to have to be ultra efficient again, I believe. Austin Eckler is going to get a ton of looks. Keenan Allen is going to get a ton of looks. Hunter Henry is going to get a ton of looks. I could see realistically Mike Williams being behind Hunter Henry in targets. He's going to be big in the red zone, but again, he has to take a little amount of volume and turn it into a lot of big numbers to give you that kind of upside. I would feel safer with him as a wide receiver 3 than a wide receiver 2. Just keep an eye on that this season. If you're trusting him, maybe look into possibly moving him to an owner that sees him a little bit more value than we do. All right, moving forward to tight ends. And again, we're going to use this information to take a look at one player in particular and say, you know what? Maybe he's just not going to return the same value we saw for him last season for 2019. And to make matters worse, even though we were a little bit lower on this player, the retirement of Andrew Luck maybe should make us halt even a little bit more at Eric Ebron's current price. So last season was a bad season for tight ends, right? You had your top 3 tight ends, and then really outside of that, unless you're Eric Ebron with all the touchdowns, it was difficult to gauge on a weekly basis who was going to be good. Well, Eric Ebron was a huge target in the red zone last season. He was 3rd in total red zone targets with 31, and then for red zone receptions, he was 3rd with 17. He also turned in the highest amount of touchdowns in the red zone with 12, and his target percentage of 28.7 was 5th most in the red zone among tight ends. His reception percentage put him at 3rd with 25.8%. So in the red zone last season, that is where Eric Ebron made his money. That is where he was spectacular last season for the Colts. Now, when you look past not only the red zone, but looking into the end zone itself, he absolutely dominated all other tight ends when it came to end zone stats. His end zone targets last year were 18. Next closest player was 11. That's Travis Kelce. His touchdowns on end zone targets last year was 10. Next closest player was Zach Ertz at 5. His target percentage in the end zone was 16.7%. That put him at number 2. And then here's the big one. Reception percentage in the end zone, or reception percentage on end zone targets, 15.2%. The next closest player was CJ Uzomah from the Cincinnati Bengals at 7%. This season, Eric Ebron is going to have that same type of production to be a high-end tight end 1. I don't see it happening. He is going to have to be ultra efficient in the red zone again. But keep in mind, even though we have a saying on this channel, #NeverFunchess, Devin Funchess is still going to be there and is still going to be a weapon in the red zone. Paris Campbell could end up being a weapon in the end zone as well. You have a lot of more weapons there this year. Nyheim Hines in his second year, we talked about a guy like James White and a guy like ALVIN KAMARA, how they were so useful as pass-catching backs in the red zone. What if they can utilize Nyheim Hines the same way that they used James White in New England? What if they're able to do the same thing with Nyheim Hines? That's even going to cut into it. When you got to the red zone last year, you knew that Andrew Luck was going to be looking for Eric Ebron a majority of the time. He did, and Eric Ebron turned those into receptions and turned those into touchdowns. He would have to do the same exact thing in 2019. And if you haven't heard, Andrew Luck just retired. I like Jacoby Brissett. I think he's going to be decent. I think he's a quarterback 2 in fantasy. I think he can help them win games. I don't think he's going to be what we saw in 2017. I think he'll be much better than that. But to rely on Jacoby Brissett to help Eric Ebron get that same type of return, I'm just not buying it this season. Unfortunately, I think he's going to be at best a low-end tight end 1, and that is if Jack Doyle doesn't get hurt. If Jack Doyle gets hurt, then maybe that goes up a little bit. But if Jack Doyle is healthy all season, then that number could even go down for Eric Ebron. Definitely a guy I'm going to skip on this year because of how efficient he was in the red zone last year. I just don't see it happening again. All right. Last but not least, quarterbacks. Got a couple of different players I want to highlight in terms of end zone usage and red zone usage, both passing and on the ground. 2 guys that I really want to key in on that could potentially provide really good value for you in 2019. Okay, so for end zone passing, now one guy in particular that I found extremely interesting in terms of his numbers was KIRK Cousins. KIRK Cousins last season had 21 touchdowns on passes to the end zone. Now, when you have weapons there like Kyle Rudolph, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen, it makes it a lot easier. Andrew Luck led the league with 25, then Russell Wilson at 24, Phillip Rivers at 21, KIRK Cousins at 21. So technically, he was tied for 3rd there. He only threw 1 interception as well in the end zone last season, which was one of the best numbers in the league. There was quite a few players who threw 2, 3, 4, and Jared Goff had the most at 5. And then KIRK Cousins' touchdown percentage was 3.5 to passes in the end zone last year, which put him at number 5. Now, targets to the end zone last year, he was at 10. He had 39. Now, like I said with Eric Ebron and Mike Williams, like the volume, or more Mike Williams and Eric Ebron, but like the volume wasn't there, but the target percentage and everything else was there. Kind of the same thing with Kirk Cousins. Now, his actual volume into the end zone was a little bit better, 10th in the league, 39 targets. That's not bad, but I'd like to see a little bit more. If he could target the end zone more this season and have the same kind of efficiency, then he could be a guy that could be a really, really good steal for you. I mean, he's a guy that's being taken as like a low-end quarterback 2 right now. If you could get him, if you take him as your quarterback 1 in 1 QB leagues, I don't know if you'd necessarily be disappointed with it. I've talked about it on this channel a lot. There was only like a separation of 0.2 between a mid quarterback 1 and a low-end quarterback 2, low quarterback 2 last season in terms of points per game. It was like 0.2 or something like that. It wasn't a whole lot of points. So again, he could be a guy that you draft really late, and if he can be that good in the end zone again, that could be pretty decent value to return. Now, the other person I want to highlight, Dak Prescott. This is on his rushing ability, though. Last season, for rushing attempts in the red zone, obviously Lamar Jackson comes in at number 1, 38, above and beyond Deshaun Watson at 22. But Dak Prescott was all the way down at 19. That's not bad, especially considering he was second in red zone touchdowns with 6. Josh Allen had 7. His red zone percentage and rushing as well. Now that was a little bit lower. That was at 25.3%. Now, but that's one thing I've talked about all offseason with Dak Prescott, is the fact that if Ezekiel Elliott is there and playing every single game, now again, when this was recorded, we still haven't heard anything. We still believe he shows up for week 1. We'll have to just keep an eye on that. But if he does show up for week 1, that is what makes Dak Prescott so dangerous this year for fantasy outcome. When we're talking about running quarterbacks, we're talking about Josh Allen, we're talking about Kyler Murray, we're talking about Lamar Jackson. I mean, we're looking at these guys that might put up a ton of volume when we're running the football. Well, what about a guy like Dak Prescott that's not going to put up a ton of volume, but he has a really good situation and a really good offensive game plan that allow him to be very efficient with the runs he has. He has a very good offensive line. I know they've got some injury concerns right now, but they have a good offensive line. He has Ezekiel Elliott. He has Amari Cooper this season as well. So he has the weapons, and let's not even forget Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup, a guy that can stretch the field. So he's got a ton of weapons to use this season, which again, if they're in the red zone and they call some of those quarterback options, that's an opportunity for more fantasy points. He's had at least 6. He's had 6 rushing touchdowns each of his first 3 seasons in the NFL. Give me that little bit extra. Again, a guy that's being drafted is a mid to low end quarterback 2, has low end quarterback 1 upside in 1 quarterback leagues. In super flex or 2 quarterback leagues, you get the guy even later. And honestly, if you were to pair a guy, like I just said, a guy like a Dak Prescott, a guy like Kirk Cousins, you could end up looking really smart by the end of the year because you didn't use a high draft pick on a quarterback. You filled out all of your running backs, you filled out all of your receivers and your tight ends, and now you make some really good value picks that are low-end tight end 1, or low-end quarterback 1s, high-end quarterback 2, really at worst. If that happens, you look really smart because, again, on the points per game, there's not going to be a whole lot that separates quarterback 1s and quarterback 2s this year. Just because they're a quarterback 2 doesn't mean that they don't come in at like 15 or 16, but they're only 0.5 points, 0.2 points per game off of quarterback 1s. Again, that happened last season. Your low-end quarterback 1s were only a couple of decimal points off of your low quarterback 2s on a point per game basis because of how crazy the field was in terms of being pushed together with talent. Quarterback is a very deep and very talented position this year. Again, we've been preaching all year to wait on quarterbacks. If you did and you went with that kind of flexibility with your quarterback position, you could look really smart at the beginning of or at the end of the year when you win a fantasy football championship. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps it up. Our Red Zone report from 2018. Again, don't forget that Tony Culler at Fantasy Gold FNTSY on Twitter is going to be doing these articles every couple of weeks. So if this is information that you think will be very valuable towards winning a fantasy football championship in 2019, Tony is going to be taking a look at how players are doing in 2019, so don't forget to check out all the content on thefantasyheadliners.com. Do me a favor, everyone, before you click out of the video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you become a part of Headliner Nation by subscribing today, let us know in the comments below so myself and everyone else from Headliner Nation can welcome you to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Fantasy Headliners. We'll see you on the next one. Have a good one, everybody.